Hello everyone, welcome back to Byte Marx. We are doing something quite serious today. We are going to be talking about relatively current South African affairs and politics. And joining me today for this very special episode is Matthew. Say hello, Matthew.
Hi.
Yeah, that's very South African.
Don't know what else to say. Hello, how's it going?
I was half expecting, I was half wondering if you were just going to say how's it. Thank you for joining us today, Matthew. Why don't you tell the audience at home about your professional experience, and then maybe they will take a guess as to what we're actually going to be talking about.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, it's Matthew here. So I'm studied law at the University of Pretoria. I studied BA law first, and then LLB after that. And then I'm currently working as an attorney at Roots and van Rensburg Inc., which is a law firm that does a bunch of different stuff, but general civil litigation.
So you're a civil lawyer?
Yeah, civil litigation. It's various fields in that, but yeah, that's the way you can define it, I guess.
All right, sure. So if we're going to be talking about civil law today, I think the viewers at home, given recent political events, maybe you can put two and two together. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. We are talking about the recent, quote-unquote, South African insurrection. I think we might make an argument today that maybe it wasn't quite an insurrection, or maybe it was. That will remain to be seen as we go into this episode. But yes, we are going to be talking about the recent political and civil unrest that had gripped South Africa for quite a while. In some cases, we are still dealing with the after effects and the aftermath of that unrest and that strife. But we thought it would be a good idea that now that the dust has largely settled, Matthew, you can confirm or deny that, that we would do an episode to talk about it, to contextualize it, because it was news and it was global news in some cases. But the problem was most people who are looking at this, and even many South Africans, probably don't really have the necessary context, I think, to understand what was going on and to really frame this in a way that isn't just more black and white thinking, right? South Africa has a very complicated political history, and this country has an incredibly complicated relationship with both civil unrest, protests, and looting. And I brought Matthew on today, who is a lawyer, who has experience dealing with this particular kind of law, or at least in this area, to help us really understand what happened, why it happened, and how we should frame our thinking about it. Is that's more or less right?
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, sure. So without any further ado, Matthew, why don't you begin at the beginning? How exactly? Where should we start? Should we start with Jacob Zuma? I think we should start with Jacob Zuma.
Yeah, I think we can. I think it's with these kinds of things, you can always go further back in history, so we can't go to the beginning. But I think, okay, so I think to begin matters, I don't think we can go too far back in terms of Zuma's entire career, his entire political career. But I think a good place to start is maybe the Zondo Commission. So it was basically, the full name is the Judicial Commission of Inquiry into Allegations of State Capture, which was launched by Jacob Zuma's his government, and that was in sorry.
Just quickly, for viewers at home who might not be South African, South Africa has only had a few presidents since it has become a free republic. Our first president was Nelson Mandela, who was internationally renowned. The president that went after him was Thabo Mbeki. And the third president, Jacob Zuma, is the first in our recent history to actually be investigated in terms of corruption and various nefarious dealings. So this, you shouldn't think of it at home as being an old political case. This is very new. This is very relevant. Jacob Zuma was essentially replaced by Cyril Ramaphosa, and we will talk about that a little bit later, but please continue, Matthew.
Yeah, so I think a lot of what we're discussing is quite novel. If you look at our sedition laws and all of this, it's all very new. So Zuma is groundbreaking. His presidency, in a sense, or the way we are persecuting him, is quite groundbreaking. So this Zondo Commission was basically to investigate state capture, which is a very specific kind of corruption. It's essentially when the government itself forms corruption, and they place certain individuals in certain government institutions or parastatals, which are kind of government institutions, And then what will happen there is that there's a kind of collusion. It gets quite complicated, but essentially this commission was to find out and investigate what was going on in the public sector and the organs of state surrounding.
So basically, state capture is basically just a collusion, an illegal collusion between private business and government entities.
Yes, yeah, very specific kind of corruption. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
So this Zondo
we'll start with the court case.
Yeah, I think so. This commission was obviously set up in 2018 January, on the advice of our public protector, and then they started investigating. And one of the people called to this investigation, it's sort of like a court, an informal court, but it still has the same effect of a court. Was Jacob Zuma himself to give testimony. And what he did was he refused to arrive and he refused to give evidence at this commission. And that's what led to the events that we're kind of getting into, the whole why people were protesting his arrest. So initially what happened was the Zondo Commission brought an urgent application to court in January 2021, 28th of January 2021. And they wanted Zuma to come and give evidence into these allegations and into investigations into state capture and all of these things. They just wanted him to give testimony, to put it simply. So the Constitutional Court compelled Zuma to go and give this evidence. And specifically, they compelled him to appear on the 15th to the 19th of February 2021. They said, you must go. And this is a court order. It has the effect that you must follow it. Yeah.
Is that a subpoena?
It's different to a subpoena. A subpoena is when he was subpoenaed and he ignored the subpoena. So this came.
So then they compelled
him. It's a specific kind of application you bring, that you say you compel someone to do something with the effect of a court order.
Okay, sure. And then I assume he didn't go.
He didn't go. He also released a public statement saying he won't go. He basically said that the proceedings he was being victimized. This was his own words. He said he was being victimized through exceptional and harsh treatment, that the Constitutional Court were politicizing the law to his detriment, Jacob Zuma's detriment.
Interesting.
Yeah, so he basically said this was, in a sense, a hit piece against him, that he should not be compelled and that he won't abide by this court order. He said it publicly.
Okay, so he was basically challenging the court to do something about it, really. If he wasn't going to comply, they were going to be stuck.
Exactly. And a quick side note is the Constitutional Court is our biggest court, in a sense. It's the American equivalent of the Supreme Court, their main court.
It's our highest judicial body in South Africa.
Yeah, so if you're telling our highest judicial body, no, I won't abide. It's a serious challenge, to their legitimacy and their power, basically.
Yeah, it essentially it is a challenge of the entire legitimacy of the institution of the court, because if they don't compel him to do something and he refuses to do it, well, that kind of throws the question of, can the court actually get people to do what it says it can, and so on and so forth. The entire legal process basically rests on something, like the system shouldn't be challenged in that way. So it definitely moved a bit further. So what happened next?
Cool. So then, obviously, after all of this, his public statement and this, it was brought again to the Constitutional Court on the 29th of June, 2021.
That's quite a gap.
Yeah, it is.
So from February all the way to June.
Exactly. And what's important to note is the Zondo Commission's the period that they could operate ended in March of 2021. So they no longer had jurisdiction to really call on him. And that's why when he ignored it and that time ran out, there was no ways they couldn't compel him to give testimony anymore, because in a sense, their mandate ended in March.
That sounds like quite a sneaky trick.
Yeah. So he essentially thought, okay, it's done now. They can't really do much from here. They can't force me to do anything. So what was interesting, what happened after that on June 29th, the 29th of June, 2021, is that the Constitutional Court again heard this matter, and they found him in contempt of court, which contempt of court is quite a complicated legal. It's simple, but it can get quite complicated as a legal concept. But it's essentially saying you've held the court in contempt, and there's many ways you can do that. But it's generally a punitive thing. You punish people who don't follow the court's directives. You can then
in this case, refusing to comply with the court order is contempt of court.
Yes, exactly right, and that would be civil contempt. You get criminal contempt, which is where you're disrespectful in court, or you do something, swear in court, or something to that, or lie in court, or then you get something civil contempt, which is essentially what he did, ignoring a court order, not appearing before court, that kind of thing.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, cool. And then so then what was interesting at this Constitutional Court decision, they found him in contempt, and they sentenced him to 15 months imprisonment.
That's quite amazing, actually, if you think about it. A former president actually being sentenced in a court. It's almost unprecedented, really, for any modern or young South African to really think about it in that terms. But yeah, that's kind of crazy.
There's a lot about this court case that's completely unprecedented. I mean, the fact of the matter is, contempt, very seldom you get prison time. It's really a measure of last resort. It's often a fine, and what will often happen is that you will be compelled with the contempt order to do the thing they want you to. So they'll give you another chance, and then saying if you fail that, you'll get prison time.
Yeah, they really don't want to use that kind of power in that kind of way, but it sounds like they were given no choice.
Exactly.
Zuma was trying to call their bluff, and I don't think they were going to have it.
And I think Justice Kampempe, who was the sitting main justice of the Constitutional Court on that day, he essentially recognized that. So there's a majority and a minority judgment. The minority basically didn't want to put him in prison. They said, we can't use our powers to this extent. And that, the minority, I must just check, was led by, I can't remember the justice's name.
It's not that important right now. But the point is that there was a majority consensus. We have to use our power.
Yes.
Zuma's defying us. Let's go and do this. Okay, so then what happened?
Yeah, so then after that, on July the 2nd, 2021, Zuma brought an urgent application to the Constitutional Court to rescind that judgment. And rescinding a judgment, its rescission, basically means that if a court order is granted within a certain amount of time, you can say that this wasn't the right judgment, there was something incorrect about it, and I want the thing rescinded and basically scrapped. Okay.
Yeah, just take it back.
Take it back, essentially. So he brought a bunch of factors like his ill health. He was 79. There's high risks with. He had a number of factors he brought to the court's attention, but essentially it was then postponed to be heard on the 12th of July.
Okay, sure. Can you imagine if Jacob Zuma had come out as being anti-vax? That would have been.
That's actually interesting. There's a movement now. They related to the protests. They're having this kind of shutting down the country. I don't know if you know about it. They actually tomorrow, Monday, they want to shut down the country to get Cyril Ramaphosa out. But one of the points they have is kind of an anti-vax point. So I just thought that was funny. There's actually a relationship there.
Americans, you're exporting of anti-vax propaganda. Americans in the UK, your exporting of anti-vax propaganda is there's someone should be tried in Geneva. That's all I'm saying, because that's a serious health crisis. But we're getting sidetracked. So Jacob Zuma is he's basically charged in contempt of court. He issues his appeal, and they say, okay, well, I'm old, maybe I'll be high risk, yada yada yada. Fast forward to I think it's July 6th. That's when Zuma's trying to get another court, I can't remember which one, to stop him from being arrested.
Yes, so it wasn't an appeal, it was a rescission. There's a slight difference.
Rescission, yeah.
But
rescission.
Similar kind of idea, but yes. And then July 6th, the problem being is that they wanted to hear it after he would have been in prison, the 12th of July. So he brought another application at the High Court to interdict the police stopping them arresting him. So he tried a different approach, not a rescission, but an interdict to stop the police acting and arresting him, which is but it was a very strange strategy because he went to the High Court, which if you know anything about the structures of our court, obviously the main court, our Con Court, what they decide filters down. But the court system doesn't work that a smaller court or a lower court can tell a higher court what to do.
Yeah, imagine if some court in a rural town was trying to tell the highest court in the land that they're not legitimate. It doesn't work like that.
It's a strange move, and he basically went to a high court, which is a few rungs down from the constitutional court, to tell the constitutional court to basically combat their decision by stopping the police arresting him. So it was a strange, and nothing precluded him in our law from doing that, but I think it's quite accepted in our law that you can't really ask a lower court to affect the court order of a higher court. It's just kind of accepted in our law.
It's a legal chain of command.
Yeah, so I think that judgment then was reserved to Friday. Again, delayed.
Lots of delays.
Yeah, so...
Yes. So I want to skip ahead just a slight bit.
Yes.
Maybe to help move things a little bit along. So we have basically some legal back and forwards that are going on here between Jacob Zuma and the Constitutional Court. And the idea basically is that they want him to come here because he's central to the Zondo Commission, which is trying to investigate corruption, state capture, all of these things. He doesn't want to. They keep trying to force him to. He keeps trying all these schemes to do all of these things. And then ultimately they decide, well, we're going to hold you in contempt of court. We're going to put you into prison. And then, well, how exactly let's move a little bit forward and go, okay, well, how exactly did they try to get him arrested? And what are the circumstances around that? Yeah,
so essentially there was a lot of people, his supporters in a sense, but a bunch of people outside of his home saying things like they would prevent this happening, they would stop the police and all of this. The police had a statement on the 7th of July saying that they will execute this and they will go arrest him by midnight on that day, which was when the order... And there was a lot of fears at the time to think, is this actually going to happen? What happens if people prevent the police from arresting him?
I have to ask at this point, because I think it is important. Is there much in the way of legal precedence for civilians acting outside of any kind of official authority using, or not using, but resisting the police's attempts to arrest someone? How common, I mean, not common, but is this something that actually happens more often than we realize? Does the law actually have like a provision for, hey, the police can arrest all these people that are also trying to stop, us from arresting Zuma? What's going on there?
So it doesn't, in this way, no. It doesn't.
Because it sounds like a very unique situation.
In this kind of set of facts, people do resist arrest and hide from the police, but they do it in different ways. They will hide from the police or skip the country.
Run away.
But not be in a known location and basically say, I have a stronghold that you won't get into. That's not common at all. No.
It sounds more like the setup for a Far Cry level than an actual legal case. But like I said, this is why I think it's so important to have you on, because this case is a very strange thing. Yes. It's very unique in terms of both our law, but I also think just the law in general. It's not something that I would expect to see very often. You could imagine a comic book where, like a president of a country is like, no, you guys are not, and then they have to send in like the Suicide Squad or Batman or someone to get Jacob Zuma out of Nkandla. Nkandla is his home, but it's weird, right? So they tried to arrest him. Then, what happened then? So that's unless you feel you want to give some more context.
Well, I think to maybe labor the point a bit, but it is very unusual. I think, and it's not just one thing. There's quite a few unusual things that happened here. So it is important to understand it's an ex-president. This has never really happened where we've taken someone of this profile to prison. I think also the fact that the contempt doesn't often... It's actually changed. It set precedent to change the contempt laws in our country a little bit. So there's quite a few unique things going on in this, and just the fact of the matter that he was in the stronghold where the police could potentially not get to him. What happens then? Do you bring in the military? Do you bring in more cops? It's a lot of this was unknown, and luckily it didn't come to that. Luckily he did end up sort of handing himself over or coming peacefully into the custody of the police. So, but it is interesting to kind of speculate what could have happened if he did hold out and his thousands of
I can't imagine what would have had to happen if there had been like a shootout or a fight between the pro-Zuma supporters and the police trying to arrest him. I can't imagine that would have ended well for anyone, really.
No, exactly.
But thankfully it didn't.
I think.
Thankfully it didn't come to that.
I speak under correction here, but I think this has happened sort of in compounds in maybe like the United States of America, where they've had cult type things in compounds where people are armed, and they've had these shootouts where the FBI have to go and.
There are some situations. I think one of the most famous ones is the Waco siege.
Yes.
But I think it's different in the sense that those people were in a cult and they were outside of society.
Yes.
This is a former sitting president of the Republic of South Africa who is attempting to basically resist arrest by mobilizing a mob of civilians to stop the police from arresting him. And we have to wonder as to, A, what did he think was going to happen? Was he hoping that he would call everyone's bluff? Or maybe he was hoping the police would attack and that would, use a cause like a public outcry. Or, I don't know, it's weird because, like I said, the situation feels like something kind of a comic book. It doesn't feel like something that happened in real life. But thankfully, thankfully Zuma backed down, I think. Yes. But we wouldn't be here if that didn't, lead to more situations. So now I think we get to the point where the protests started to happen, yes. Right? Or rather, the protests were going on, if I'm not mistaken. There were some protests at the same time as he was being arrested. Yes. But then the protests started to escalate greatly. Why don't you tell the viewers about that? We can move the timeline a little bit.
Yeah, perfect. I'll make a quick note on the Zuma thing. I think
sure.
You were mentioning it there. I think Zuma's very much part of our power structure still. He's still very involved in our politics, and anyone who knows a bit about South African politics understands how much influence he still has. So the fact that he did resist it, or was potentially going to resist it, it moved from the rounds of contempt into like treason and sedition kind of thing. That's
yeah, we will talk about that.
Yeah,
definitely.
So I think that's it's important to note.
Just for your viewers at home, because many of our viewers are not South African, Jacob Zuma is in the power system of this country in the same way that Donald Trump, despite not being president anymore, is still in the power system of the Republican Party. I think what makes it amazing from our perspective is that someone like Jacob Zuma was actually going to face criminal charges, whereas someone like Donald Trump, will not really face criminal charges. Yeah. And you can imagine that in the United States, that if, say, the FBI went to go arrest Donald Trump, that I think maybe he might do something similar. He might call on QAnon or something like that to rise up and, arm a militia to attack the FBI. I don't know. I don't know. This is wild, bizarro world that we're living in.
Yeah.
But it is very much a problem of the political system that we have and the way that it has become entrenched, where you have these people who are in the political system for a very long time. They have a power base that transcends just the actual appointments that they've got. And it's very clear that they have the ability to drive up, mobs of people around them. It's hard to say if this was just a bunch of people who had been duped, a bunch of people who are just stupidly but naively, believing that Jacob Zuma is actually legitimately being targeted by illegitimate processes, or if these people are all sort of, opportunistically being paid to come there and, almost like false flag that operation. But I don't want to get too far into speculation. Yeah. So back to the protests. So you were saying.
Yeah, so with the protests, I think the points you made now are actually really relevant to the protests, because you've got to think, why did the protests happen? So briefly, an outline on what happened at the protest was that there was a lot of looting took place. So a lot of what happened was shops, our supermarkets, things like that were looted, ransacked, especially in our province, KwaZulu-Natal, but in other areas of the country as well. KwaZulu-Natal, by the way, is where Jacob Zuma is from, and his strongest support is from there.
Yeah. Again, we have to contextualize it a little bit for non-South Africans. South Africa is a very multi-ethnic society, and in particular, there are different tribal affiliations and ethnic affiliations between members of the black population that don't always necessarily seem obvious.
Yeah.
KwaZulu-Natal, in particular, of course, in the name KwaZulu, is the stronghold basically of sort of the Zulu sort of population in this country. And Jacob Zuma, by virtue of being Zulu, I think has that kind of affiliation in the way that he wouldn't have had he been in another province. And it's no surprise then that the biggest unrest, the biggest mobilization of people happened in KwaZulu-Natal.
Yes.
But it was, as you said, something that had happened all over the place, because initially it seemed like this was just a political thing that had gone out of hand. But then slowly but surely, as we were watching on the news, gradually it unfolded from just a political protest, which I guess maybe you could argue that's what resisting arrest in this context was. But then it unfolded into way more complicated things. And please continue, because this is...
Yeah.
This is very strange.
So yeah, look, you've also it's very hard to these kinds of things. You need to investigate for a long time to get to the true cause, and there's always going to be a lot of factors. People doing things for different, they're protesting for different reasons. Some people might feel that this was an unjust imprisonment. They might feel that in our country we have a history of political people getting imprisoned for trumped up things, and they might have felt that this kind of contempt of court, where it was straight imprisonment, they felt the nuance of the law wasn't applied correctly. I don't think there were too many people in that camp, but it's hard to say. So some people might have been protesting for that reason. Other people, maybe it was a sense of opportunity. A lot of people I know I've spoken to feel like, it was just, they were chances. They just felt like getting a new TV or fridge. I'm sure you've heard this narrative as well. I don't think that's very fair on the... You can't just say that for every protester, but yeah, I'm sure there would be one or two people like that. I don't know.
Yeah, no. One of the things that characterizes, I think, the way that protests are presented in our society is really a hyperfixation, essentially, on property crime.
Yes.
Basically, 24/7, while this was going on, while this insurrection was going on, almost immediately you could see that the media stopped really focusing on the political issue at the heart of this, which is Jacob Zuma, and the way that he was mobilizing his followers, and they immediately pivoted to showing pictures and footage of like people breaking into shops, shops being vandalized, or the people, taking things out of stores. And I think there's a tendency, right? And just by virtue of the fact that it was sometimes called an insurrection, I think highlights that there is a real disconnection, I think, between how we think of politics, quote unquote, and how we actually, perceive people going on. Because like you said, I don't like riots. I don't like looting. The Byte Marx podcast does not endorse any of that, right? However, and this is where, I might lose some people, we have to understand why these things happen. We have to understand, why do people do these kinds of things? Why do they behave in these kinds of ways? Because, no one, I don't think, or the majority of people don't want to be in those kinds of situations. Why? Because people were killed, right? I think there were a number of casualties that were caused by this unrest. Lots of people were probably hurt. Who knows how many people got COVID, because it was impossible to social distance. It's impossible to social distance in a riot, right? A protest, a peaceful protest, that's one thing. A riot is totally, different. And this is on top of, I think, an important factor. And here's where I want your opinion. Do you think that the COVID situation maybe was, on top of all of this, one of the catalyzing factors for why it ended up being not just a single set of protests against a single person's arrest, but rather a much wider moment of civil unrest and civil discord?
I think you could definitely see it as a catalyst. I think in South African context, I don't want to get too deep into property law and stuff, but you mentioned property law. It's a big point of contention for many years in South Africa. One of the biggest controversies of the constitution is I think it's section 23, but I stand corrected, on property law and the way it's entrenched old ideas. So, but I don't want to get too much into property law, just to show that it's a complicated it is a complicated
Yeah.
thing.
I do want us to swing back a little bit because
Sorry.
you mentioned, of course, that there's a combination of different things. How exactly does South African law define the difference between, say, a protest and, say, a riot?
Cool. So we've defined them. There's the Gatherings Act. So we define things as lawful protests and unlawful protests. So a riot would be classified as an unlawful protest. And essentially with a lawful protest, there's a bunch of steps within the Gatherings Act that you follow. You basically apply to the person you either protesting against or the structure. You apply to the municipality or whoever it is for permission. And that's how you have to protest.
Yeah.
They can reject it and you can take it to court, but you must keep in mind that it's a very costly thing to do. So
there is this fundamental imbalance, right? Where sometimes there is an injustice in society. Like, let's take for example, I have been let's say I'm working in a store and the employees, all of us, we're being abused. We're not allowed to have, bathroom breaks or, whatever, right? We're very heavily abused by the working conditions of our store. If we look at the law and we go, okay, well, we have to protest the treatment that we're getting, and we take our petition to the store manager or the company that owns the store, and they're like, nope, sorry, you can't protest, or yeah, you're allowed to protest, but you have to do it on your time off, yada, yada, yada. Obviously, that's not going to help us. So in these cases, we have to really understand that even though there are differences between what we might consider to be legitimate and illegitimate protests, we also have to, I think actually it's better to think of it in terms of like two axes, that you can have a lawful protest that has legitimate cause, or an unlawful protest, a riot essentially, that is legitimate in nature, and one that is illegitimate, I would argue that in this particular case, the inciting incident of preventing Jacob Zuma from being arrested, I don't consider that to be a legitimate consideration. Jacob Zuma is, or was and is, maybe we split that hair, remains one of the most powerful people in this country. I don't think there was any meaningful threat to his life. South Africa has a long history of police violence and abuse, like the assassination of Krasani and all of those other people, where the police definitely are involved in killing people in their custody. However, I don't think that the protest was legitimate. And the fact that it spiraled into something much larger, I think, is definitely a factor of the issue that South Africa was also dealing with the COVID situation and the economic hardship that had been enforced on the government, by this economic condition. I think almost in a way that like Jacob Zuma was just the spark that ended up lighting a match of tinder that had already been there from the start.
I definitely say that. I think there's always been an undercurrent of, I think I want to quickly define sort of protests very generally.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
But so protest simply is, a public expression where you object or disapprove of something, generally politically. And the problem with that definition, which you can find on Google or whatever, is that it doesn't really account for what protest actually, the heart of protest is you questioning power and you criticizing power. It's power structures, and you don't have the means. If you can do it internally, you do it internally. You just follow the correct legal means. That if someone broke the law, you follow the law, and then you can correct it. A protest is something where you feel there are no internal ways to solve the problem. So you go outside of the structure in a sense. And that's why you gather, and that's why there might be violence in these things. If you pick it and then there's a fundamental contradiction within law. This is now my opinion, in lawful protests, where you say, yes, you can question the power structures that be, but you must do it within the power structure. And it must be approved.
Yes.
Which is a fundamental contradiction. And if you fall out of that line, it's now an unlawful protest and we condemn it. But that's why I like your access to say legitimate, unlawful, and illegitimate lawful. Unlawful, sorry.
Yeah, I'm not a
no, but it's a good
like that. But I do think that I think you're right. Certainly, if the powerful are the only people who get to decide what is allowed, then there is no means of changing that. In our own history, in South Africa's history with apartheid, there was no legal way that people of color in this country, or anyone really, could have turned outside. They could have turned apartheid out from within.
Exactly.
They couldn't have changed it. The system had to basically face a challenge that would force it to basically change, and that was never going to be a peaceful assemblage of people. no matter how good those goals are, right? I don't like violent protest. I don't like unrest. I don't like discord. I certainly don't like looting. But these are all products of, it's often said, the riot is the language of the unheard. A protest, in my opinion, is people trying to be heard, yes. Right? I think a lot of people don't necessarily immediately jump to the most violent or most destructive or most chaotic version of whatever it is that happens. I think that, when people are trying to protest something, I think they care enough to try to change it. And if those people were heard, if they were listened to, then I don't think it would escalate further. And unfortunately, I think here's a case where maybe this axis is good, because I think that even though there were illegitimate origins of this civil unrest, if there was, this idea that we can basically subvert the law, which is not something, that I'm generally in favor of, and then that net widened out, because as people started to mobilize, as people started to, gather together, I think that's when more people realized that the desperation of their situation was maybe catching up to them. I think I don't believe necessarily that people are black boxes, that they make their own decisions absent of others. I think that we are very much environmental creatures. And the deprivation that had been induced by COVID, because, let's face it, the government has bungled the COVID situation quite heavily. I keep saying this, but the government should continue to be paying COVID grants, and it has dragged its feet on that. Lots of people were desperate, lots of people were hungry, and in that kind of conflagration, those people can be induced to do things that maybe would not be normal to them otherwise, right? Because just look around, people don't behave in those kinds of chaotic, disruptive ways, because invariably people don't want that kind of chaos, but they can be, incited to engage in it if they can be sufficiently made more, desperate or, things like that. And I think drawing that line between, I don't think of it as a binary thing, right? I don't think of it as just purely legitimate, lawful, or illegitimate, unlawful. I think of it as there are elements here that we have to navigate more carefully. And speaking of, I do want to sort of question sedition, right? Because one of the reasons why people were calling it an insurrection is obviously because there was a movement of people to try to basically overturn the state process, to overturn the legal process. And, I want your opinion on to what extent does that actually apply?
Yeah, I think just to comment on your previous points there, sorry.
No, sure.
Within the South African context, I think it's hard to generalize, but South Africans, I think, fundamentally understand that protests, are questioning power, and that's why there's a tendency in South Africa to have violent protests because of apartheid, because they understand that these peaceful protests don't work if the powers that be don't listen, or don't have any obligation to listen to what you say. So within that context, I think violent protests make sense. Not that they justified in any way, but you can, I think, contextualize them a bit better, understanding our history of protest, of violent protest during apartheid. So I think so. Sorry.
I also just want to preempt something,
yes.
Some criticisms that might be thrown
yes,
away.
Yes.
A lot of people would say, I don't condone this, but, right? The reason why I think it's important to say, on the one hand, I don't like looting, I don't like violent unrest, I don't like any of that, I don't condone it, this podcast doesn't. But we need to think about this in a better way, we need to think about this in a more comprehensive way, we need to understand why it happened,
yes.
Right? And the reason why is because I don't want it to happen in the future.
Exactly.
You will never, ever stop unrest by trying to squish it down with a boot. Right, you just won't be able to do that, because that's not how. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
People don't behave in that kind of way. If you understand why people are acting out and you fix that root problem,
yes.
They won't. I want your opinion on this, but I genuinely believe that if the COVID situation had been handled better and more people were either capable of sheltering in place, or they were more able to access, the financial resources to keep themselves going while the economy was shuttering, then I think that far fewer people would have come out to capitalize on essentially an escalating protest. I think far fewer people would have shown up to Jacob Zuma's arrest. I think far fewer people would have mobilized in the streets. I think there would have been far less looting, there would have been far less chaos, simply because why would someone risk that situation when they would be comfortable, in their homes?
Yes, if they had it in the first place, they wouldn't need to.
Yeah, if they had it, if they had it, the way to disarm, to prevent civil unrest, is to solve the contradictions in the society that produced the unrest in the first place, right? Yeah. That's not to say that Jacob Zuma's situation was not unique. I think in a lot of ways it is very unique, because I don't think a president has tried to challenge the court in that kind of way. But I don't necessarily, want to argue that it isn't something that we have to actually take a look at, because there will be another Jacob Zuma. There will always be the potential for another one of these 1 in a million legal situations that, cause the people of the country to kind of go out. I think the fundamental issue is that we have a lot of inequality in this country that doesn't ever get addressed. Yeah. People don't talk about it. We just kind of accept it as it is, and South Africans just kind of almost... Yeah,
that's one of the underlying issues. That's diagnosing. So COVID, I think, just as you said, it was a catalyst that exacerbated what was already there. So I think if we dealt with COVID better, it definitely would have helped, but it wouldn't have. Obviously, I think it's just symptomatic of what's been happening for quite a long time. Not to get too political, but I don't think the issues of social inequality have been addressed in our country correctly or adequately, I should say. And I think COVID was just emblematic of that.
No, I also want to make this clear. I do think that the ANC government has fundamentally kind of failed to live up to its promises of managing the actual inequality of this country. You can listen to our other Byte Marx podcasts for a deeper explanation about that. But not to get too political, but I do think it's kind of capitalism that is to blame.
Yeah, I think.
But I did want to, but I did want to talk about sedition, right? Because I was hearing, that people were attacking, things like cell towers, and that the military was involved, and there was a sensation. I think there was this idea that maybe, this is gonna explode at any second, that the country's gonna, explode into a civil war, where they were like. I hate to say this, but there were totally ridiculous people with forming civilian militias. Yeah. Not completely ridiculously, mind you. There were definitely areas where I think that people should definitely come together to protect themselves. But there was this sense of idea this is this next South African civil war. I just want you to talk about do you think that do you think there was sedition? Do you think there were actually people who were trying to use this as a political pretext to, I don't know, overturn, if not democracy, but the legal system or something to that effect?
So, quick disclaimer, we are entering the realm of speculation, but
the
Surama pauses...
All of this is...
Yeah.
All of this is speculation in Minecraft,
no, of course.
Guys.
But, the government themselves have come out, there's preliminary reports, the intelligence agencies come out and said there are underlying forces, and that the extent to them is unknown. It could be there's some big convoluted thing. I don't think it's that big. But there might have been some forces. I can't say definitively. There's no proof of that. But I think the government themselves have said that they've seen some evidence of a sedition kind of element to this whole thing, where people have been instigated. And a quick definition for sedition, just to clarify it.
South Africa has, from what I remember, South Africa has kind of strange sedition laws. But please continue.
Yeah, so our sedition and treason laws, since apartheid ended, we haven't really. I think there's been one case that they've been enforced. We don't try people for this, and I think that's also a contextual problem. I think during apartheid, it was used a lot just against political opponents. And I think
basically any
resistance was seditional treason, and people got death sentences and stuff, and it was used as a tool to silence people. So I think our new legal system really wanted to avoid. They wanted to encourage political discourse and all of these things. So they don't want it's not enforced really. But sedition is defined basically you incite someone to rebel against the authority of the state. So it's incitement. Mm-hmm. And treason is the act itself. So if you go and bomb a postal office or something, if you commit the act yourself, that's treason. If you incite others to do it, it's sedition.
Yeah.
And
so there is this. This is the tinfoil hat conspiracy theory time. There is this idea. Certainly, I know this idea is very popular on social media, which is why you should always take it with a grain of salt. But there is this idea that Zuma was actually, or at least allies of Zuma, were orchestrating and inciting the riots into something much larger than they would have been normally, by taking advantage of people's desperation, by maybe, I don't know, seeding provocateurs amongst crowds, or, just going and doing these actions to try to cause as much chaos as possible to basically strong arm the government into, either releasing Zuma or, ignoring him or putting him to the, putting him on the back burner, or maybe just to cause enough chaos in the country that the government is forced to deal with other things and, to basically just derail the existing investigation into the, with this whole Zuma thing.
Yeah, so
that's definitely a conspiracy theory.
But I mean,
there's no
goes further than that. The whole idea behind that theory is that that it's basically to get Cyril Ramaphosa out of power, and to replace him with someone who's loyal to that camp. Generally, I'll call it the Zuma camp. I'm not saying it is the Zuma camp, but just for clarity's sake.
Yeah. There is this idea that taking it a step further, that if there's enough chaos in the country, if enough South Africans are dissatisfied with Cyril Ramaphosa, that basically they can either force him to resign or step down, or maybe they can force the ANC to recall him. Right, our government works differently from the United States and other countries. We don't necessarily nominate a president. We nominate a party, and the party basically chooses the president. So in this particular sense, now this system has pros and cons, but basically the idea is that if enough pressure is put on the ANC, they could recall Cyril Ramaphosa without actually, needing to do much in terms of legal situations. Whereas if the president were elected, that would be a different situation. And then if they recall him, they could replace him with someone who might be pro-Zuma and might actually, sort of grease the wheels. But I guess that also comes back, circling back to the idea of state capture, right? Because those would be private, or maybe even some governmental forces who are trying to basically subvert the entire political system. And they can only do that because they have disproportionate resources to mobilize people. Like, I don't necessarily think that it 100% happened. I think that there is some of it that I do believe is believable, because I know that governments, the United States did this in other countries, right? And they did this in Latin America. They did this in the Middle East.
And it's happened
before. They did regime change.
In our country, it's happened before. If you, as you mentioned earlier in the podcast, our second president, Thabo Mbeki, his term didn't run out. He was recalled by the ANC because he took on Zuma politically, and he lost that political battle. Now, that's generalizing it a lot, but it's essentially he got recalled by his own party and he had to step down as president. So it's happened. It happened to our second president.
Yeah, it happened, but I think the situation that makes this one unique is that...
Different, yes.
It was... Number one, it was civil unrest. Number two, it was Zuma resisting arrest. The fight that happened between Mbeki and Zuma was a kind of behind-the-scenes, backdoor, cloak and dagger kind of thing. This was way out in the open. This was way up there. And I think it's a unique situation because I think it brings to stark reality just how volatile our system can be. And I think in a lot of ways, South Africa was very lucky that we emerged out of that crisis in the way that we did. There wasn't... please.
Oh,
continue.
Sorry. I would say that's actually handled quite well. From my perspective, I think it could have been handled a lot messier. There could have been, the military could have shot people. There could have been, these kinds of things, which was what, if you subscribe to that conspiracy theory, what people were saying was the goal was to try and get some kind of mass violence. Americana situation, which was an incident that happened quite a few years back where a lot of miners were shot, essentially.
By the police.
They were
illegally murdered, I think, while on the strike or something similar.
Yes. And so maybe a situation like that to try force this. But again, it's hard to say if there is an element of that, this sort of sedition behind the scenes stuff, how much of it was the protest, how much of it was just simply people are living in an unequal society and they see a protest against the structure and they want to be involved in that because they are unhappy, they do not have what they need in life, so they have no other means to. So how much is, which it's impossible to say unless you you need to have a study or investigation into this thing and see what. Yes, but
I think someone, there are definitely lots of good academic research that will probably happen.
Yes.
I think in the future. But I think it's always important to make the case now.
Yes.
That we shouldn't think about this in black and white terms. Right? We shouldn't think about this as entirely good, entirely bad, that there are either one or the other, that it's either entirely, totally innocent people that were just rising up to, challenge the system that was ignoring them, or that it was entirely like a political social op. I think the way that I think about it is that there were really three sort of pillars of this entire situation. There was a political faction, an organized political event, a power structure in a way that was trying to use people for its own ends. There was a criminal element, because South Africa is the most unequal nation on the planet. We have a strong criminal element in this country, yes. And it's a powerful criminal element. It's an organized criminal element. In a lot of ways, the crime in this country is more organized than the labor.
I get that.
Yeah, it's a true statement.
Yeah.
Definitely there would have been criminal syndicates that would have been operating, that would have known, hey, if this riot is going to happen, let's hit these stores, let's do these things, let's take these goods and then resell them, let's steal a bunch of goods that we can later resell in the black market.
That's very plausible, I think. Yeah.
That's definitely plausible. And then of course into that mix there were probably just genuinely desperate people who were in a situation where they thought, hey, maybe I can get a bit of myself, maybe I can get some things that I want. Obviously, I don't think that everyone is just a selfless person, trying to take food. I think definitely people are, going to behave in terrible ways when they're put in terrible situations. I think people would have, taken whatever it is that they could get their hands on. But I think over fixation on the property crime is to a detriment of actually solving the problem, because there was a political crisis that was going on and there was a social crisis that was going on. I think South Africa still hasn't really reckoned with our economic situation. Until we do that, until we do things like paying COVID grants, until we start to equalize the economic situation for the majority of South Africans, we will always have the potential for breaking out into more violence like this.
Yes.
Right? South Africa was a nation that was birthed in violence, because we had to have a armed struggle. We had to have a complicated relationship with dealing with apartheid. And unfortunately, the system that replaced apartheid was politically quite different and politically quite good, but economically very much kind of similar in a way. And unfortunately, the resistance, like you said, you were talking about the power, right? Power doesn't want challenges to it,
yes.
Right? So it'll try to limit it. So the people who are left in South Africa today are in this weird situation where they have, on the one hand, one of the most progressive, well-made constitutions of any country on the planet, and maybe legal experts can argue about that one, but I think that's true. And on the other hand, an economic system that is still largely preserving the same fundamental power relations, right?
Yes.
Between people, and it leaves us in this weird situation where we have to confront an old problem, but with new methods. And what we've seen with this insurrection is that South Africa still has a lot to do in terms of actually solving these problems. There will possibly be another Jacob Zuma. There will possibly be, another major protest until we can actually deal with these underlying, situations.
Yes.
Is there anything else that you would like to cover at the end? I think we're almost at the end. I think we've covered basically every angle.
I think I'd just maybe end with saying that we need to diagnose these issues properly and correctly. And it's not done with simple black, as you said earlier, black and white sort of painting of the picture that it's these mindless looting. You can't just paint it that way. It is a complicated thing, and until you address these issues with nuance, and you won't diagnose the problem, you won't solve the issue, and it'll keep happening. So I think you need to have these discussions to try and get an understanding of what these underlying issues are, so that you can try to fix them, and then they don't happen in the future.
Yeah, because I've always said it. Like, you can be frustrated, you can be afraid, you can be angry, you can be all of these things about the state of the country, right? About these protests. But if you just revert to this very simple, often racialized narrative that unfortunately, that there is this inherent instability in the black community, then you will never actually fix this problem. You will never actually deal with this problem, because the truth of the matter is that any person, any group of people that are put into these situations will behave in these very similar ways. We see it all over the world, right? South Africans need to have perspective. And this podcast, I think, hopefully can provide some perspective to say, yes, there are elements of this that were criminal. There were elements of this that were, factional and political. This could be a great political novel, if it wasn't the real world. Like I said, Batman could just be swooping into and
I think this would be
Jacob
a
Zuma.
great case study. They must write a novel about it as a case study.
Yeah, I think all of these things can be true at the same time.
Yes.
Right? And I think as South Africans, we have to resist the temptation of easy answers, because I think easy answers put us into this position in the first place, right? We have to be willing to have these conversations, and we can be very upset about it, right? You should be upset that all of this is happening. You should be angry, but you should always direct your anger at the actual system, the actual power that is keeping you in this position, and not at the symptoms of that power.
The real cause.
Okay. The real cause. I think that's a good place to end everything here.
Perfect.
Matthew, I've very much appreciated having you on. I would love to have you on in future. South Africa and the world is a very legally complicated place, and we definitely need more expertise. You can shout yourself out if there's anything that you would like to shout out here.
Oh, just quickly shout out Miles, because I think he's a friend of the channel, and he's the one who got me involved. But yeah, definitely.
Yes, Miles.
Miles Lobo.
Largely unemployed. His channel will be linked in the description.
Yeah, perfect. And I just want to thank you for having me on. I had a great time, and I'll definitely be on in future if I'm invited. Thank you.
I look forward to commissioning some fan art of Batman swinging out of holding Jacob Zuma. That would definitely be funny.
That sounds amazing.
So this has been Byte Marx. We thank you for listening. We hope that you've learned something. Our social medias, all of that stuff is linked in the description. If you like the show and you would like to support us, we have a Patreon link. But if you don't want to give us a regular donation, that's perfectly fine. We also have a buy us a coffee link. Even if you don't, we don't really, we just want people to share the content, like it, subscribe to the channel. That means more to us than, necessary Patreon subscriptions, although that would be nice. We would like to grow Byte Marx. We would like to get to 1,000 subscribers. Callum and I are working on our secret project, which is yet to be revealed, but it's coming. Don't worry about that, guys. And we thank you for showing up. We thank you for listening to this episode. We hope that it's been good. Take care, everyone. Be safe. Take your vaccine if you can. I got mine. I have to get my second dose. But thank you, everyone, and good night, and be well.